Mm-hmm.
All right, we are live.
Hello, everybody. Hello, Lisa, and welcome to Dark Ozarks on YouTube.
Hey, Josh. Hey, everyone. Hope everyone is having a great Wednesday.
And, of course, for people who might be unfamiliar, Dark Ozarks is Lisa and myself and all of our compendium of research as folks connect about all of the dark things in the Ozarks. And sometimes, because the Dark Ozarks are a crossroads in more ways than one, that research spreads out. And excited about tonight's episode, both here and then a long format version, which will be uploaded later and will occur live, if you're watching live, on Facebook in about 25 minutes. But this combination of two things that I think are really fascinating, really capture people's imagination, which is black magic and then hoodoo, which has cross-cultural connections with voodoo. There's lots and lots of things that all come together. But before we get to that, we have an amazing sponsor.
Yes, we do. And I actually stopped by there today.
I saw the picture
yes.
that Bob posted.
Yes. And he says hi.
Hey, Bob.
Yep. And he actually gave us some t-shirts. So.
Oh, fantastic. I am excited about that. Cannot wait to get mine.
Yes. We have t-shirts and we have one to give away. So we'll have to figure that one out.
We will we will figure out a process for that.
Yeah. We'll figure something.
Yes. Somebody who can answer several things from several of our podcasts. Hey, when we get swag, we're gonna make you work for it. That's my idea. Always Buying Books is in Joplin, Missouri. It is the location is actually a historic location. It is a TARDIS. I guarantee you, it is larger on the inside than it is on the outside. Bob and Elise. Now, we've grown up with Amazon essentially at this point. Many people have. There is something incredibly enchanting about physically going to a bookstore. However, not all bookstores are created equally, and they're heavily influenced by the curation of the store itself. And Bob and Elise do an amazing job of curation. I was unbelievably happy. Just a couple of weeks ago, we got to go in, and I walked out with a small stack of books. I kind of held myself back a little bit, but the prices are fantastic. The book selection is amazing. Folks, you need to stop in.
Yes, and there's something for everybody. That's
There's an incredibly wide variety of genres that are available. Of course, the stuff like American history, world history, paranormal, and occult was sort of where I landed for myself and walked away with a nice stack of books on those subjects. But there's just a really wide variety of great stuff. Children's books, thrillers, dramas, romances, fiction, nonfiction, really historic. Yes. And the building is haunted as well.
Mm-hmm. Yes, it is. From its prior incarnation as a wedding chapel.
Yes, absolutely. And there you go. Along those lines, for people who want to learn more or follow, because Bob posts regularly. Bob and Elise both, for Always Buying Books, post regularly. They even have their own group where online can folks find out more about that?
Well, they have a website, alwaysbuyingbooks.net, but they're very active on Facebook, just like Always Buying Books, and they have a group that's friends who like Always Buying Books, and you can get inventory off of there, etc. And even if you're not local, you can purchase it and have it mailed. So go check it out.
Yes, highly, highly recommend it. If you're in Joplin, go visit. If you're not in Joplin, visit online. You will not be disappointed.
No. And then
Oh,
we have an interesting topic tonight: black magic and hoodoo.
black magic and hoodoo. This is a multifaceted genre of information. I'm excited to combine the two and pull out some notes on this. I think there's a lot of misconceptions about all of this.
Mhm.
There are also, I would say, one of the initial misconceptions, which appears to be something that dates back as a misconception all the way back even to the eras of witch hunts in Europe, is that how do I put this? That there's many different magical disciplines,
Yeah.
and they all get essentially lumped under the umbrella of witchcraft.
Yeah, it's sort of an amalgamation. And there are very distinct traditions.
Very much so. And I think something that is actually associated with a lot of the mystery and the mystique, because it's probably because of its accessibility to traditional communities, is what in the Ozarks are called granny women.
Yes, very much so. Granny women, just as they would be referred to in Appalachia, similar tradition.
Yes, and this is what I would generally classify as, well, there's midwifery, there's herbal healing, there's sage advice, sage in the traditional sense, not in the burning sage sense, and just a little bit of a joke there, but really women who held considerable importance within a community because they were essentially functioning as female shamans.
Yes, pretty much literally so. I mean, in different times and in different locations, they probably would have been called shamans.
And it's, I think it's of particular interest. I'm curious, as you think about it, I hadn't really thought about it that a whole lot today, but as you think about it, there is a potential, certainly from a European tradition, for the place of the female shaman dating back to some really interesting pre-Christian lineage.
Yes.
And I think that it's not uncommon when you say the word shaman for people to associate that with men, which of course there are also ancient traditions that do tie to men as well. But I think it's not unfair to conjecture in terms of Northern European or European lore that there likely was a shaman class accepted through many different ancient European societies, or essentially Indo-Aryan societies in Europe, and that they were associated with perhaps a goddess motif, and associated with healing and mysteries and understanding and seeing things that everyday folks could not.
Exactly. And most historians and researchers in this area do tend to believe that these traditional societies were more dominated in that regard by women than men, actually.
And it's, in some aspects, I think it makes a lot of sense. There's a lot. I'm gonna if I'm not careful, I'm gonna go like straight into long format.
Yeah, you can't
long format content. However, something that I am particularly, there's two directions. There's the fork in the road. I got to the fork in the road and I took it. The fork in the road on this one, and we'll dig specifically into Cherokee Black Magic references as well throughout the two formats tonight. But something that is striking to me is that in some aspects of essentially doing a comparative lore or comparative religion analysis between Northern European or Central, essentially European settlement ancestry and Native American, with an emphasis on the Cherokee in particular, that there are some areas that you really can see strong crossover, and in other areas completely not, and the category of witch in Cherokee Black Magic is vastly different than the European category of witch.
It is. That is something that you look at and you do not see a hint of a shared background or framework. But that's also what makes it interesting. But by the same token, in the broader sense, you are still talking about the same outcomes.
You are, and there's that being one aspect that I find really interesting. Another aspect coming, harkening back to a predominantly European base, is that obviously we have what I would classify as witch traditions in any of the individual lores, your Germanic lore, your Nordic or Viking lore, various aspects of Celtic lore. We have a witch tradition in the Southern European lore, in association with, for example, Italian tradition, etc. That said, we also have a Greco-Roman influence, a Greco-Roman influence that ties heavily to the goddess Diana, and the references to the moon, also the references to Hecate. And I find that really interesting because obviously this is a really, really ancient, a connection, and that seems to have created, quote unquote, I'm going to use this umbrella term very, very loosely, but just as a concept, a Greco-Roman influenced witch cult that seems to have spread throughout Europe to a degree. But there's also the question of how much of that has been retconned, essentially, in the 20th century by people who simply didn't have any more to go with, because a lot of those original records, etc., weren't even made. There weren't records in many cases.
Exactly. And then when you throw the Germanic tribes and the Celts into the mix, it gets even murkier because there were even fewer records. And one thing that I think most people don't realize, when, especially if they're shopping for books online about, Celtic witchcraft or this or that, it really is all just conjecture, because no one really knows too much.
It's and that this is
may get Rotten Tomatoes thrown as for that, but it's true.
Well, we'll dig into this, see if we can make anybody mad, and then switch over to long format. But I do think that this is an interesting reality, because, and I'm gonna respectfully name some real names in comparatively recent religious history. Gardnerian witchcraft, and Crowley, and Wicca. Yeah. And I want to be very clear, I'm not speaking negatively in regards to Wicca. It is in many cases, a very, what I would classify as a very respectful and beautiful ritualistic tradition that ties elements of folk magic, particularly European and Northern European and Celtic folk magic, into what I consider to be a very beautiful understanding of the natural rhythms of the season, the solstices, the equinoxes, the Sabbats. There's a lot that is very beautiful about embracing a less modern calendar, essentially.
Well put.
That said, for the uninitiated, there is the expectation, or perhaps the misconception, that this is a very, very old religion. And there are plenty of people who certainly would be willing to conjecture, and it's, I think, archetypally resonant. So why wouldn't we want to say,
Right.
well, I came from this line and we somehow managed to save the books or save the lore or save the manuscripts or whatever, when in reality, the likelihood of that is unbelievably rare.
Yes. Perhaps perhaps some knowledge handed down through generation over generation, but also facing the problem that it was systematically discouraged, and so often information was lost because someone at some point decided not to pass it down to the next generation, and
Yes.
So we have bits and pieces, but the framework, it's kind of all guessing.
It is, and what seems to be the case in many situations is a conflation. And I'm not saying it's a bad thing, but it is oftentimes a modern recipe is a conflation of elements of what we do know about Celtic lore, which admittedly is not a lot in terms of the specifics. The greatest or the most specific records that we have of traditional Celtic religion center around Greco-Roman accounts,
Right.
written down around 2000 plus years ago. And those, I'm not questioning the existence. We don't question the existence of the accounts, but it is interesting because these are accounts written by the enemy. And
yes, and certainly the accounts of the Druids are a good illustration of that.
Yes, this is the civilized Roman chroniclers recording their barbaric enemies and their enemies' barbaric ways. And you can't help
enemies that they were a little frightened of too.
Yes, which is rather delicious when you think about it, especially for those of us of Celtic ancestry. The Romans were just a little bit afraid of us.
Yeah.
And considering I'm doing just a bit of my own conjecture, and we'll get into some Welsh lore as well. But the bulk of my Celtic ancestry is Welsh, as you know, Lisa, and consequently, the likelihood that I had my grand ancestry has not been does not include Roman occupation is very, very low.
Fair. Yeah, and mine is predominantly Scottish, so yeah.
And the Roman occupation did not make it there, so because they were afraid.
That running into battle naked, painted, thing.
I know it. It's I think there's a if you read the accounts or hear the accounts of Boudicca, who burned down London in retribution against the Roman occupation, and if you hear those accounts and something stirs mightily within yourself and your being, chances are you've got at least some Celtic ancestry. It's a rather beautiful thing. So in this regard, we've got but the Celts were not. The Celts did not have a written language,
No,
and
no, it
so
was all word of mouth.
yes, and I'm going to throw in for just a moment. We associate that with primitivism. The Celts were undeniably a sophisticated people. Their sophistication ran counter to the culture that ultimately dominated the region, which was
Right.
the Romans, who had a written language.
And we're bureaucrats. They tallied everything up, and the Celts didn't quite operate the same way that we know it.
I can appreciate that every time I stare at a spreadsheet. So I'd be really probably okay with a return to a more sophisticated but slightly different era. Although I would miss my books, I will say that. And
Yeah. Okay. So they weren't bad for everything.
no, the Celts now, as in terms of now we're supposed to be talking about witchcraft, and I wanted to talk about the Celts. I'll make this point and then we'll transition. The Celts very consistently throughout the generations did something that I've always found fascinating, and I hope to be remembered for something similar. Is that faced with assimilation, faced in the face of assimilation, they would somehow always manage to take the trappings of the assimilation and make it their own. And to me, the fact that the ancient Celts were renowned for not having a literary tradition, and yet within really a pretty short period of time, from AD 200 to AD 900, in the larger scheme of things, by 900 we were already seeing a flourishing literary tradition in Ireland and in southwestern Scotland.
Mm-hmm.
And give it several more hundred years, moving into the modern era after lots of war. By the 1800s, some of the world's greatest writers and poets were Celtic.
Yeah. Including Walter Scott.
Yes. So, I think that's, to me, there's some sort of lesson of refusal to be assimilated even throughout the assimilation process.
Work within the rebel within the system.
Rebel within the system always. And there's, I think, an interesting tie-in in terms of how witchcraft traditions existed during those times, because certainly beginning in really in England under James the First, beginning of 1602, 03. Okay. That there was widespread persecution of quote unquote witchcraft throughout Britain, and of course and also in continental Europe. It wasn't just James the First.
No, and I guess in all fairness to James, part of that started is that when he was on his way to London to be crowned, because he was the King of Scotland at the time, to be crowned the King of England after Elizabeth died.
Yes.
As he was embarking on the journey, he was met by a witch who cursed him.
Yes, and they in the sea voyage, there was also a really dramatic storm that took place. Things froze up there for just a second. There was also a really dramatic storm that took place in the North Sea during their sea voyage at that time.
And altogether, he took all of it very seriously and unfortunately started something that morphed into witch hunts.
Yes, and I do think that you bring up a really good point, which I appreciate very much, which is it is easy on this side of history to vilify James I when that really was not his particular character, that he's a very complex king, who did, I think, comparatively speaking, a lot of good, and, really holds a really important place in English and consequently American and also modern history during what was really an extraordinarily tumultuous period of trying to understand the world.
Very fair, very fair, and so we have to look at it in that context, I think. Maybe that is a good place to stop and switch over. And then if you want to hear more, and we're going to be going a lot more into black magic and hoodoo,
Yes.
watch for the long format. They'll be uploaded probably tomorrow.
Absolutely. And we'll be over on Facebook shortly. Please like, share, subscribe, click the notification bell, follow us here on YouTube, and also our corresponding Facebook page of Dark Ozarks.
And we appreciate it. Thank you all. Good night.
Night, everybody.